Hi, this is State Senator Tom George. Welcome to my program, Current Events. And today I have with me a returning guest, one of my favorites, Kerry Chartkoff. And Kerry, you are the state of Michigan's capital historian, and you wear some other hats as well.
I have the honor of being the capital historian, which means that I'm in charge of the history of the building itself, and the first person actually ever to have that position, so I'm quite proud to be able to tell you that that's so. I also am the executive director of the Michigan Capitol Committee, which is a legislative executive committee that oversees the Capitol, and during the restoration, that body, the Capitol Committee, oversaw the restoration itself. After the restoration, which was 1989 to 1992, was completed, then the Capitol Committee continues to today to maintain the building and make sure that the restoration is maintained and the building stays restored and is properly used. And as we know, you happen to chair that committee at the moment. It's a very important way that we protect the building. And as again, I serve as the executive director of that committee.
We should maybe just as a reminder mention that this is Michigan's third Capitol building, right? The first one, of course, would have been in Detroit. And the Capitol was moved to Lansing, and then we had a temporary structure.
Correct. It wasn't really very temporary. It was supposed to be temporary because there was no Lansing in those days, only a place in the woods. And this site selection was surprising because it was chosen because there was absolutely, literally nothing there. And the idea was that maybe for a year or two there would be some sort of temporary structure. The legislature would convene there in the January of 1848 and be gone forever by, several months later. Didn't work out that way. They did convene in January 1848 in a temporary structure, hastily thrown together in a few months in the spring of 1847. But they were still occupying that same temporary structure 30 years later. A city grew up around it very quickly, and because of the intense arguments about where to locate a permanent capital, Detroit always lobbying to get it back, Grand Rapids, Adrian, Ann Arbor, every other, even in the Upper Peninsula, arguing that they should be the capital, everyone said, enough, let's just leave it in Lansing. Also, the Civil War intervened, and during the Civil War, this was not the topmost issue on the legislative agenda, and so it sort of just stayed in Lansing, and the city grew up around it. And then in the 1870s, the governor at the time, Governor Baldwin, said, I think we're going to keep the Capitol here, but let's build something better. And the problem was that the temporary Capitol was built of wood. And there had been several very, very severe fires in the state of Michigan. Chicago had burned down.
Holland, Michigan.
Yes. And fire was a huge and ever-present danger. And so Governor Baldwin said, let us build something that will last the centuries. Proof of fire, he said, so that the state library doesn't burn up. He didn't say a word about the poor legislature or anything else, but we have to protect that library. And the legislature agreed, and so in this 1871 we began to look around for an architect, and in 1872 they began to construct our present Capitol. I think Governor Baldwin called it pretty well, because when the building was finished, it was finished for the future generations of Michigan citizens, and it was considered to be our permanent Capitol forever. It's now almost 130 years old. It's doing pretty well.
Before we start talking about the new Capitol, we should have to point out that the first governor to take office in the temporary wooden Capitol was the only governor from Kalamazoo.
Oh, well, we do need to notice that.
Epaphroditus Ransom, and he served that 1 2-year term, and he actually stepped down to run for the U.S. Senate. And at that time, the U.S. senators were chosen by the legislature.
Correct.
And he lost. And so he returned to Kalamazoo. Later, he served as a state representative.
Oh, that's interesting.
Prior to that time, he had been on the Michigan Supreme Court, and so he's the only person to serve in all three
branches.
And certainly the only governor to come back and serve in the legislature.
His story is not an unfamiliar one. Other governors also tried to step down from the governor's office and run for the U.S. Senate. It wasn't any more successful for them. Austin Blair, who stands in front of the Capitol, is another good example. However, Austin Blair got a statue on the Capitol grounds, and Epaphroditus Ransom has a ginkgo tree.
Has a tree, right.
He does, which I think is wonderful, actually. So they're remembered in that way. And in fact, that's one of the fascinating things about the Capitol. The more you know about Michigan history, the more fascinating the Capitol becomes, because it's, for the last 130 years, history has played out under the dome and on its grounds. The more you know about Capitol, the more you understand and appreciate Michigan history. So it's a relationship that is very rich, and if you know nothing at all about Michigan history and you come to the Capitol and take a tour, which are free and available on the hour and half hour all day long during the week, Monday through Friday, just come into the building and ask. You're going to learn so much more about Michigan history in that 1 hour tour than you ever imagined. On the other hand, if you are even very experienced in Michigan history, then what you learn will be even richer. It's worth a trip for anybody.
We should say something about the architect of the Capitol, and I should ask you to say a few words about Elijah Meyer, especially in light of some of the new things that we've learned. And
Absolutely.
He designed not only the Michigan Capitol, but the capitals of Colorado and Texas.
Correct.
And we have a portrait of him in the Elijah Meyer room, in which we sometimes meet. How was he chosen to be the architect?
It's a very interesting story, because Elijah Myers was young and virtually unknown when he won the competition to design the Michigan State Capitol, and it was a national competition. And the reason he won, and there's a number of reasons, but the main reason he won is that this is a time when the field of architecture in America is beginning to try to reform itself and become the modern profession it is today. Up until that time, it was very common to select an architect because, well, you knew him, or he was related to someone, or they had always done all the architecture in a particular region and had a lock on all the projects. That was very, very common. But this had led to a lot of problems. And now America, after the Civil War in this 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, this is the time period where we're building America. And many of the wonderful historical buildings we look at today as part of our heritage were constructed in those years. And there's money available to design these buildings in ever and ever growing numbers, and it's a lot of the times tax money. The architectural profession realized they had to institute professional standards and really police themselves if they were going to survive and do well. And so as a consequence, they instituted the blind design competition. That meant that any architect could submit a plan. No one would know who the architect was. It was all done under codes. And then a board of commissioners would select the best. Well, Michigan turned out to have a superb board of commissioners who were much more functional than almost any of the others anywhere else in the country. And many capitals are being built in this time period. And they scrutinized the 22 plans that were submitted and chose the one that they thought was not only the handsomest, but also was the only one they thought could be built for the $1.2 million that they had told these architects was all that was going to be allowed for the project. All the others were far too elaborate. And they chose the designs of a then young and almost unknown architect named Elijah E. Myers from Springfield, Illinois, originally from Pennsylvania. And that's what launched his career. After he designed our Capitol, he went on to successes in Texas, in Colorado. He designed 2 other capitals, neither of which exist any longer, more than a dozen courthouses, and buildings all over the United States of every kind, from houses to jails, to stores, to estates, to business buildings, to anything, hospitals, prisons, and became one of the most successful architects of his day. But when he died in 1909, he died in almost total obscurity. Even though he had moved to Detroit, and he's Michigan's own, Michigan does not well remember him today.